Hey, what's going on? So, 2 weeks ago, the teaser trailer for Spider-Man No Way Home was leaked and then subsequently released, and there's a lot going on. Peter's identity is now public, Doctor Strange teams up with Spider-Man to drop their pants in Eiffel Tower of the Multiverse, the Sinister Six are all going to be there, and they're the villains from the previous Spider-Man movies, and they're all gonna get cosmic, interdimensional revenge on a Peter Parker from another universe. So why are they mad at this Peter if they have no emotional connection to him? I don't understand that. Regardless, everyone loves it. I think it broke a record for the most global views for a trailer in 24 hours. And honestly, I'm glad that people who like MCU Spider-Man are probably going to like this movie as well. It doesn't look like I'm the target demographic for it. The first two installments weren't my cup of tea either, which I've made more than enough videos addressing. One would say too many, but I'm glad that it's an interpretation that's getting a lot of love nonetheless. Now, on the topic of Spider-Man films, a few years ago I started a retrospective series on the Spider-Man movies, and then I stopped, because the videos were just progressively getting more and more negative, because outside of that first Andrew Garfield movie, I don't particularly like the other Spider-Man films. I mean, okay, no. I like Spider-Verse, but that's animated. And I tend to not compare animation and live action because those are just apples and tomatoes. I mean, yeah, they're both red, but outside of that, they're totally different things. Where was I going with this? Right! So around that time, I was asked if I would ever talk about James Cameron's cancelled Spider-Man film, which I often bring up with great reverence. And the answer to that is yes. So instead of talking endlessly about the Spider-Man movies that we have that I don't like, let's talk about a Spider-Man movie that was never made that I probably would have loved tremendously. So getting right into it, in the early 90s, James Cameron was getting that old slurp glorp 9000 throat pie testicular drainage tickle treatment, courtesy of Marvel Entertainment, to make a film adaptation of their prized beloved property, The X-Men. But in that process, Cameron and Stan Lee got to talking, and as it turns out, Cameron was a huge Spider-Man fan. And in the same way that Lyndon B. Johnson promised the American people that he would dedicate all of his resources to building the Great Society, but then later said, fuck that, I want to go to war with Vietnam instead, James Cameron took a solid look at Chris Claremont and the X-Men Office representatives and said,
"See you, chump." What the hell?
So in 1996, James Cameron got to work on a Spider-Man script, Mint, which is some shit that he made up. It's like 50 pages, so it's too short to be a script, which usually runs about 100 to 150 pages on average, but it's too long to be a film treatment, which is usually no more than 2 to 3 pages. But I mean, he's James Cameron, he's the bravest pioneer. I feel like after making Terminator 2, he's just allowed to do whatever the fuck he wants to do. And over the years, I've seen a lot of people rail against Cameron's Spider-Man proposal, often saying that it's one of the worst things they've ever seen, and that it would have destroyed the Spider-Man brand, often criticizing Spider-Man and Mary Jane's bondage sex scene on the top of the Brooklyn Bridge, and that one scene at the climax of the movie where MJ's been kidnapped by the film's primary antagonist, and Spider-Man valiantly and heroically stands and exclaims, "I'll kill you, motherfucker. Do you hear me? You're dead." And yeah, this movie would have been a little intense, but at the heart of it, this would have been a quintessential Spider-Man movie. James Cameron gets Spider-Man, and not to dog on the 8 Spider-Man films that we've gotten over the past 20 years, because each of them brings something unique to the table and highlight a core aspect of the character. The Raimi films perfectly highlight the struggle of balancing a dual identity, with one being the blue-collar everyman, and the other being a high-flying superhero. Meanwhile, the Mark Webb duology highlights the bizarre, sci-fi horror nature of the character's mythology, while also dealing with Peter's relationships with his family, his romantic partners, and his friends, and how being Spider-Man has just as negative an impact on those relationships as they can a positive impact on New York as a whole. And then there's the MCU Spider-Man films, which perfectly encapsulate the trials of being a naive teenager who thinks that he can save the world just by punching its problems, and the inevitable reality check that comes as a consequence. But somehow, James Cameron managed to get all of that into this one 45-page glorified film treatment. And that's why I feel like if this movie got made, not only could it have been the ultimate Spider-Man film, it probably would have changed the nature of superhero movies moving forward. In the same way that films like Blade, Bussy Swinger's X-Men, and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man served as the template for some of the most popular comic book movies of the past 20 years, I feel like if James Cameron's Spider-Man wasn't cancelled, and it was released in 1998 or 99 or whatever, superhero adaptations like The Dark Knight, Logan, Black Panther, Captain America Winter Soldier, and Man of Steel, yes, you heard me right, Man of Steel, wouldn't be considered exceptional or taboo, but instead would be seen as the industry standard. But that's just me simping for this movie that was never made. But now I'm going to talk about it like we've all read it, so if you want to read it for yourself, I'll have a link posted in the description below. So, the movie starts off with Spider-Man just hanging around on top of the World Trade Center because it's 1996. And he's sort of doing the kick-ass thing. He's narrating the events that led up to him being Spider-Man. And the whole film is set up as a flashback, so to speak. And I don't want to just sit here and compare this to the other films, but immediately there's this built-in explanation for why there's internal monologue. There's no Suit Lady. There's no Karen. There's no Edith. And it's not like the Raimi films where the narration is only there to bookend the film and feels kind of randomly inserted. It's just Peter reminiscing. And I felt like that was a pretty good way to do that. And once the flashback starts, the film begins establishing who Peter Parker is, and immediately you can tell that this is not a standard script. Scripts will sometimes have intention detailed in them, so that everybody else working off of it will have some sort of framework for how a scene plays out. But here, there's background information on Peter, like him originally being from Maryland, and that he subconsciously blames himself for his parents dying in a plane crash, and there's stuff like that all throughout this. I guess because it's a glorified film treatment, Cameron is detailing key aspects of characters in hopes that he would later flesh some of that stuff out in a finalized script or a working draft. I do like how he characterizes Peter and writes him as this social pariah, but it's a self-inflicted isolation. Peter comes from a low-income working-class neighborhood, but he goes to school with a bunch of rich kids. The script also mentions that Peter isn't up to date on pop culture trends because he was raised to be an old soul by his Aunt May and Uncle Ben, who maybe were a little too old to be raising a child of his generation. So all around, Peter has this, I beat to my own drum, and I'm a nerd, so what? He has that kind of attitude. But it's a coping mechanism for feeling inadequate in his social circle. Because deep down, he has this bitter resentment of social hierarchy because he's at the bottom of the food chain. And a lot of that strikes me as being very Steve Ditko inspired. It's very early to mid-60s Spider-Man, and it's kind of like the perfect blend of Andrew Garfield's school shooter Peter Parker and Tobey Maguire's socially out-of-touch Peter Parker. They also introduce MJ in this, and she's kind of just the typical girl that you would see in an odd couple teen romance film in the 1980s or the 1990s. And I know that some people take issue with this, not just here, but in other adaptations as well, where all of Peter's other girlfriends, Liz Allen, Betty Brant, and Gwen Stacy are all brushed to the side, and MJ's just an amalgamation of all of Peter's love interest in the comics. But I honestly don't mind, especially with this movie feeling like such a self-contained piece. And I think it's really important to remember that even though movies would often get sequels most of the time, this was well before Hollywood turned into a franchise factory. So each movie was made as though it were the first and last time you'd see those characters and that universe. So I don't mind, for the sake of simplicity, making MJ Peter's love interest. And I do like how they have a somewhat of realistic relationship throughout the film. Emphasis on somewhat. They're partners on a science project, and MJ saddles herself with Peter because he's the smart kid, and she wants to ensure that she has a decent GPA so that her parents will buy her a nice car for graduation. And Peter goes along with it because booba. And there's the scene later on where MJ is getting picked up by her boyfriend Flash, but not Thompson. His name is like Nathan or some shit. And that's the other weird thing about this movie. There are characters who are supposed to be characters from the comics, but they aren't named after said characters. I don't know, those just felt like weird, arbitrary changes to me. But MJ's getting picked up by Flash and some of his Soch friends, which is really funny and kind of dates this movie because I haven't heard the term Soch since I read Greasers in like 7th grade. And really, I mean, Soches don't exist anymore. Okay, well, no, they do. We just call them Brad and Ashley now. Anyways, MJ does the whole trying to be nice thing where she invites Peter to hang out with them. But she really doesn't want him to tag along, and she knows he's gonna say no anyways. It's really sad, but it's nuanced. It's realistic. You know, these people don't feel like cardboard cutouts, and I really appreciated that. And from there, Peter goes off to a seminar at some college. I'll just call it ESU. So he goes to ESU to observe an exhibit of genetically altered superflies. And then one of them manages to escape, and then gets eaten by a spider, which then bites Peter. And when I first read this, I was like, well, that's convoluted as fuck. Except it really drives home the idea that this was a freak accident. There is no way to replicate what happened. I mean, it's actually more well thought out than every other retelling of the origin that I've ever seen, both in comics and on film. I mean, I'm sure Miles Morales and Cindy Moon fans are going to think it's total bullshit, but I really liked it. Also, within the context of the movie, I think having it be a total random chance accident is really important, especially in relation to the film's villain. And from here, this is where I'm just going to branch away from the synopsis and just start talking, because the main idea present in this treatment that I think this movie would have been founded on is the dynamic of power when thrust upon someone born powerless, be it physical, financial, or even socially in regards to influence and the power of one's image, and how said power changes a person's perspective not just on the world around them, and how they not only see people, but their relationship with people and their new place in the universe. And this is where I really want to talk about the film's villain, Carl Strand, who, in the same way that MJ is an amalgamation of all of Peter's girlfriends in the comics, Carl Strand is an amalgamation of quite a few villains in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, and even some villains outside of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. Mainly Electro, the Kingpin, and Magneto. Again, why is he named Carl Strand and not Max Dillon? I have no idea. But I mean, come on, this was the 90s. This was that weird era in comic book movies where directors and writers were like, hey, let's give the Joker a backstory and a name. Also, what if he killed Batman's parents? You know, just stuff like that. So, putting myself in that time and place, this kind of thing wasn't all that uncommon. But I'm also just not super weird about accuracy when it comes to Spider-Man villains, mainly because, aside from Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Kingpin, Lizard, maybe Mysterio, maybe, none of the other Spider-Man villains are fully fleshed out characters, like Batman villains, or even some of Superman's villains for that matter. So, if you want to make the Rhino a guy in a mech suit, or the Vulture a suburban family man who leads a double life as a high-tech gun runner, or the Tinkerer, a black teenage girl who's essentially the leader of Intergang, sure. I mean, it's not like you're gonna ruin that character or anything. So just go for it. And I think within the context of this film, Carl Strand is a fascinating character. Carl was this petty criminal, absolute loser, but he had big ambitions. But one night, down in New Mexico, because of course it's a James Cameron film, Carl and his buddy are on the run from the cops after a robbery's gone south, and Carl's buddy dies from a gunshot wound, and Carl himself is running off into this field, and Cameron describes it as a conceptual art piece designed to harness lightning. And it's active. And Carl gets struck by lightning. But instead of dying, he gets weird, freakish electricity powers.
You've never had black lightning before.
And Carl has this ideology that by modern comic book movie standards isn't all that impressive, but in the world of movies like Batman Returns, Blade, X-Men, and Catwoman, this shit would have been revolutionary. After his accident, Carl paid an unannounced visit to the guys that he used to work for, and in a scene that's somewhat reminiscent of the boardroom scene in Batman 89, where the Joker kills that one mob boss, Carl does the same. Except he's able to bring that guy back to life, and then he kills everybody else in the room. And he makes it a point to let the world of organized crime know that he is the big dog now. He's in charge, and that those who have power are the ones who make the rules. And in the years of his ascension to the top of the pyramid, he's been actively searching for people like him, and he calls them the special ones. And so far, he's recruited Sandman, whose name is Boyd, not Flint. And now that Spider-Man is big news, he wants to bring him into the fold as well. And he has this speech, in fact he has two speeches that I think are really interesting in contrast to Peter's character arc. The first is in a scene of seduction, and it's somewhere in the midway point of the movie, and Peter's already learned his lesson on power and responsibility after the death of his Uncle Ben, and Carl wants to take Peter under his wing because he believes, and I quote, "The huddled masses exist in their vicious ignorance and limitations to lift a few exceptional people on their shoulders, however unwillingly. That's what human evolution is all about. The highest common denominator, not the lowest. Natural selection honors the efficient predator. And Spider-Man has the instincts of a predator. The top of the food chain is always held by the most advanced predators that millions of years of evolution could produce. Noble creatures like the wolf and the lion, not the cud-munching herd beast. We honor competition, right? We honor winners. But for every winner, there must be 1,000 losers. That's the law of nature. So you must ask yourself, am I a winner or a loser?" Carl's ideology regarding power is one without morality. For him, the world is made up of those who have and those who have not. And of those who have, it's a game of who has more. And this is an ideology that Peter himself is struggling with in the film. After Peter gets his powers, his first thought is, fuck bitches, get money. And then fuck bitches. He makes a really shitty Spider-Man costume that's essentially poorly made rendition of the classic suit, and he's a street performer. And then that escalates into him doing birthday parties for little kids. And eventually he winds up becoming a novelty act on a talk show at like 3 in the morning. And the power really starts to get to his head. He gets more confidence. He's less shy when talking to girls. He even starts standing up for himself. There's a scene between he and MJ where they're working on their project, and he picks spiders as the topic because he really wants to learn more about himself and what his body's going through. And MJ is repulsed. But he manages to make her laugh, and they start talking with each other more. But there's another scene where Peter sees MJ getting that Bobby Houston special from Flash, and then later that night, Peter beats the shit out of him and wrecks his car. But afterwards, he's shaking, because he's never been in a fight before, and he's scared, because deep down, the violence and how big it made him feel felt good. He also saves MJ from getting raped around that same point in the film, and Peter really starts tripping on the power that being Spider-Man gives him. But he's also ashamed of his powers, because as cool as he thinks they are, as James Cameron puts it, he doesn't want people to see him as some kind of freak. There's a bit in this where Peter makes fake web shooters out of lighters and wristwatches, and he tells people that they're mechanical. because he thinks the fact that they come out of his body is weird and gross. And I'd like to think that if Cameron were to write a full script that delivered on the intent and have a talented cast of actors and crew members, this would have made for a great puberty metaphor. And again, the other Spider-Man films kind of touch on this, but this is what the film is about. It's about growing up. It's about puberty. And it's about learning from your past mistakes and growing into the man that you want to be, despite the world around you. And in Peter's case, it's becoming a superhero. And I love Peter's journey into becoming a superhero. And this is why I cited movies like Man of Steel and Nolan's Batman. Because much like those films, this movie would have been about Peter's journey into becoming Spider-Man. Like, even after Uncle Ben dies, he still doesn't quite have it all nailed down. Because he is still an angry teenager lashing out at the world, as well as beating himself up. And again, very Ditko. It's very early year Spider-Man. And not to sound too morbid, but I kind of love how Uncle Ben dies in this. And I really like how Peter's lust for justice is illustrated in the aftermath. Because over the course of several weeks, Peter is doing these late night talk show appearances, but he needs to get paid. So he goes through a seedy talent agent to cash his checks since he can't do so because he wants to remain anonymous. So there's a scene, right? Just after he and Uncle Ben have a heart-to-heart about his grades slipping, and Ben thinks he's out there selling his ass for crack because it's the 90s, and I think that was like a big problem back then. And it's actually somewhat reminiscent of the scene between Andrew Garfield and Martin Sheen in the first Amazing Spider-Man film, where Peter tells Ben,
"You're a pretty great dad, right?"
But not soon afterwards, Peter asks Uncle Ben to drive him to this talent agency, and when he gets there, he asks the talent guy for his cut of the money. And he screws Peter over. Because, what's Peter gonna do? Call the cops? Sue? What, is he gonna go under oath as Spider-Man? So, Peter gets screwed out of his money. And then the robbery happens. And out of spite, Peter lets the robber go. And of course, with Ben waiting for Peter in the lobby outside, the robber kills Ben and takes his car. And then Peter goes on a quest to find the robber, only to find out that it was the guy he let go in the first place. And I mean, all of that is pretty standard when it comes to Spider-Man lore, and to be fair, most adaptations of the character have gotten that down pretty well. However, the robber has an identifiable tattoo on his arm, just like in The Amazing Spider-Man. But unlike The Amazing Spider-Man, where Peter never catches the guy, and unlike the first Raimi film, where Peter just up and out snatches the man's soul from his body, Peter finds him, beats him up, and then he takes him to the police. There's just one little problem. Peter's wearing a homemade primary colored full body condom, and as far as the police are concerned, he's just confessed to assaulting a man. So naturally, the cops cuff him for questioning, and then Peter breaks out, and there's this whole fight sequence between him and the police, and now, Spider-Man is a fugitive. And it doesn't help that J. Jonah Jameson, who, much like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, has been reimagined as a news anchor for the Daily Bugle, which is a local news network for the tri-state area, starts this campaign against Spider-Man. And that whole experience with the mugger not facing charges, and the cops wanting to arrest him, all of this puts Peter in a mindset that there's no justice in this world. And the only way to find it is to make it yourself. So Peter goes on the warpath, going after petty thieves, drug dealers, rapists, muggers, racketeers, cops who are abusing their privilege and beating the shit out of civilians. Everybody. It's Spider-Man versus the world. And I actually like the way James Cameron puts it. He wants to be the big, strong older brother to the world. Fix it all. Let there be no more victims, no more pain. As long as he has the strength, these senses, he's gonna go for it. And that's why when Carlton Strand tries to get Peter on his side, Peter rejects him. Because Strand is no better than the seedy talent scout. He's no better than Flash. He's no better than the cops. And he's no better than the man who killed Uncle Ben. He's just a guy who has some sense of power, and he uses it over people because he thinks that he can. And this, finally, brings me to Strand's second speech. Think about it. You can't save this world. Why? Because you can't save people from themselves. From their own brutal and venal natures. You're either a predator or a prey in this world. A killer or a victim. People are by nature violent, stupid, confused, and greedy. Why waste your gift on the ungrateful masses who, by the way, would love to see your little mask ripped off and to see you dragged through the slime? The only thing they love more than a hero is to see that hero fail, fall, screw up, to see him exposed in a scandal, arrested with his pants down, caught with his hands in the till. You know why? It lets them feel better about their own miserable lives. It's a myth that people need heroes. People hate heroes. Heroes, they make them feel bad by creating examples that they can never live up to themselves. So as long as the media can show, day after day, that the people they respect and admire are just as twisted inside as they are, they're reassured. They can sleep at night. And they can face their puffy little faces in the morning. Carlton Strand's entire ideology is very go along to get along, and by having him be the face of evil in this movie, in my opinion, takes the character of Spider-Man back to his roots. The adults have broken the world by either participating in its downfall to get a piece of the pie, or by standing on the sidelines and watching it all go up in flames. And Peter is the voice of rebellion in the face of complacency. It's very punk rock. It's very anti-establishment. Dude, it's Spider-Man! And that's why I'm so frustrated with the Spider-Man films that we've gotten, because they're all very clearly taking inspiration from this treatment one way or another, but change the context behind plot points, or character interactions, or even characterizations. For example, Peter having organic webbing in the Raimi films comes from this. But in the Raimi films, nothing's done with that idea. There's no reason why they're organic. They just are. Whereas in the James Cameron treatment, it's a source of shame because it's an analogy for... Well, okay, I don't think you need me to tell you what it's an analogy for. But there's a narrative reason behind it. Spider-Man vs. the Police, that's in The Amazing Spider-Man. And as much as I like that movie, the film never explores the relationship between Peter and New York versus the relationship that New York has with the police. And it's all boiled down to an argument between Peter and Captain George Stacy at the dinner table over Branzino. There's even a plot point where Carlton Strand hires Spider-Man copycats to commit crimes, and that really sours the trust that Peter's built with the city. And it's really playing up the anonymity of Spider-Man, which, to its credit, Spider-Verse does that pretty well. But instead of making Spider-Man New York's Jesus figure like in that movie, this makes it more cynical, and that might not be to some people's taste, but that is a running theme within Spider-Man comics. And don't even get me started on this film's commentary on wealth distribution and the schism between social and economic classes, and how that subject is handled here compared to the Marvel Cinematic Universe Spider-Man films. If anything, they're on opposite sides of the spectrum in that regard. Gee, I wonder why. Cameron's Spider-Man encounters two situations which kind of test his idea of good and evil. The first is when he busts up some thieves, or maybe they're drug dealers. He never really clarifies. This is one of those things that I think would be ironed out in a full draft. But to Peter's dismay, he finds that the criminals that he's chasing are just a bunch of poor kids, no older than he is, and they're just from a rougher part of town with less promise. And he looks at the money, and then he thinks about all the hardship that Aunt May's been through, and what that money could really do for her and her medical treatments. And then Peter takes it, but he sits on it for a while, and then the next day, he goes back to that poor neighborhood, and then he dumps all the money in hopes that it would really help somebody who needs it. And that scene is mirrored again when Peter dumps all of Carlton Strand's money across the city from atop the World Trade Center after the film's climax. And even then, he's conflicted about doing it, but he does it anyways because it could have helped someone. And that's what matters. And I just can't see MCU Spider-Man doing that. He'd probably just give all the money to Tony Stark, or S.H.I.E.L.D., or some other big authoritative figure to fix the problem for him. And I really don't want to bash the other Spider-Man films. I'm trying really hard not to. But after rereading this, that's kind of hard. Because James Cameron gets it. He gets Spider-Man. And while everybody else who's brought the character to life in live action has explored aspects of the character, this doesn't feel like Spider-Man, but they're doing this. Or Spider-Man, but they're doing that. No, this just feels like Spider-Man. And as happy as I am that this scriptment exists and is open to the public, it's really sad that we never got this. Because this is really one of those once-in-a-lifetime kind of things. Bro, this was gonna be a post-AIDS, crack epidemic era Spider-Man movie directed by James effing Cameron, coming off of the heels of Terminator 2. Instead, we got a Spider-Man trilogy that was a post-9/11 tribute to Richard Donner's Superman, a reboot series modeled after the Hollywood YA franchise engine that was left on a cliffhanger, and a focus-tested, commercially sanitized, user-friendly Spider-Man franchise, courtesy of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Walt Disney Studios. Again, not attacking any of them. Each of the films that we've gotten have their respective fan bases and cult followings, and for good reason. A lot of people worked really hard on those movies, and they deserve all of the praise that they get. But for me personally, after reading this, I can't imagine myself not being sad that James Cameron's Spider-Man is nothing more than a 45-page film treatment with some dialogue here and there. And that we'll probably never get a Spider-Man adaptation quite like this in our lifetimes. But what about you? Have you read James Cameron's Spider-Man treatment? If you have, what did you think about it? And what do you think about it compared to the Spider-Man films that we've gotten? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel. And if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.